This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by General Atomics Aeronautical Systems, the world leader in unmanned aircraft systems and makers of the affordable, scalable, and autonomous new collaborative combat aircraft.
Mary Ellen Callahan serves as the Assistant Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security's Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office. Prior to that role, she was the Chief of Staff to the DHS Deputy Secretary. Ms. Callahan has previously served as Chief Privacy Officer and Chief Freedom of Information Act Officer for DHS. She also worked as the Assistant General Counsel for the Privacy and Cybersecurity Office at the Walt Disney Company. Her expertise spans privacy law, international negotiations, and national security interests. We talk with Assistant Secretary Callahan on Zoom from her office about a recent DHS report on ways to reduce the risks of AI accelerating chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Assistant DHS Secretary Callahan. I'm Andy McCreadis, and this is Intelligence Matters.
America must not fall behind in air dominance. That's why we need the Collaborative Combat Aircraft by General Atomics Aeronautical Systems. These new unmanned combat jets are affordable, scalable, and autonomous, and they partner with traditional combat formations to let American and allied pilots see first and act first. Our next-generation jets will let Washington retake the numbers advantage in the skies. For collaborative combat aircraft, rely on General Atomics Aeronautical, the world leader in unmanned aircraft systems. Learn more at UAV.com.
Mary Ellen, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to be on.
My pleasure. Thanks, Andy.
So today we're going to talk about this really interesting and maybe frightening report that came out of DHS on reducing the risks at the intersection of artificial intelligence and chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. So before we get into the details of the report, could you just give us a little background on why you all did the report? What was the driver? I know there was the executive order back in October of last year. So maybe you just sort of set the stage.
Sure. Andy, as you mentioned, there's the executive order that the president signed last year. Pretty comprehensive, dealing with artificial intelligence, looking at its strengths and weaknesses, looking at what its potential threats are. Is there anything novel out there? What should we be thinking about? The Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, was tasked by the president to look at does artificial intelligence enhance or improve the ability to create a chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear threat using AI? And the secretary asked my office, the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction office here at DHS, to analyze whether or not artificial intelligence increases the likelihood of chemical, biological, radiological, or CBRN threats. Short answer is it will continue to make it a little bit easier. Right now, it is still very hard to understand what the formula are for biological and chemical threats, but they're still out there and they're being ingested and being included in lots of different models. For radiological and nuclear threats, there is less of that's been ingested into the publicly available models, and the level of skill would be much higher in order to be able to try to create a radiological or nuclear threat. So we really focus on the most present risk, which are chemical and biological risks, and what to do to mitigate that or to redouble our efforts to reduce the ability for bad guys to get access to these new novel threats or recipes or formulas while still improving the incredible promise of artificial intelligence.
Mary Ellen, tell me if this is, maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, but I had sort of, at least initially, conceived of this as there's a forest of information out there on all these topics, right? If AI can cut down a chunk of that forest, whatever percentage you think it can cut down, then that's what might facilitate someone being able to get to the information that's maybe most dangerous. Is that a bad way to think about it?
I think it's a great way to think about it. I've never thought about it that way, but I think that that's a really good way to start to think about it. So using your forest analogy, there's this whole forest out there. A lot of this information related to how to create, I'll just say ricin. I don't want to give out too many threats, but there certainly is on the internet the ability to create ricin. If you look at that, the artificial intelligence goes and combines a bunch of different recipes and says, here's the most effective one to create ricin. Candidly, it's unclear whether or not that's true or not. Artificial intelligence can hallucinate. They can go and combine things. There is a big gap, Andy, between the bridge of seeing what has been created to have formula, and then how do you actually have the technical know-how to implement it? How do you have the ability to create it? Go from laboratory to physical manifestation. So artificial intelligence can go and say, here's what's on the internet, and we found it, and here are the 4 trees you're looking for. These are the birch trees that you want. In addition, artificial intelligence can go and say, I see this pattern with these formula for ricin, and again, I'm just using that illustratively. It looks like you can use this, this, and this. We suggest maybe you also use this substitute, right? You think about a recipe where you go and say, what can I substitute for brown sugar? This is can be a recipe, and they can create novel formula and recipes that haven't been tested and that we probably wouldn't have thought about because we wouldn't have thought about using these unusual ingredients in order to create these chemical or biological threats. So it's 2 different things. Helping you find the trees you want, and then also going and saying, this is what you can do with the trees, and you can create this beautiful piece of furniture that nobody else would have thought about.
So of the things that we talked about, those chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, the biology one seems to be the most frightening, because of the advances in biotechnology, and you're not requiring the same kind of volumes of whatever you're making as you would for, let's say, a chemical weapon, for example, or some of the sophistication required for a radiological or nuclear weapon. Do you see it? And we'll get into the findings here of the report, but do you see that as the most worrisome? Or
I think radiological and nuclear are a separate category for the reasons that you said, but also because the information's not as commonly available. It's more in the classified space. I will note that our colleagues at the Department of Energy are doing an analysis of AI and radiological and nuclear threats. So we'll kick it over to them on the classified space. In the unclassified space, with regard to frontier models and large language models, the biological piece, we see it as kind of the most advanced, but it's most advanced, Andy, for both the threat of biological weapons, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also I want to emphasize that the biological research is most advanced with regard to finding new cures and medical countermeasures and other elements, because a lot of the information for biological formula, for research, for other deep dive information related to biology, that's already out on the internet. It's already been ingested into the models. And so they're already maturing and showing some signs of development for both the good and the bad. What we want to really focus on is increasing that promise, the cures, the medical countermeasures, candidly finding bad guys earlier in the system based on anomalistic behavior that we as individuals, as humans, might not see, and that the artificial intelligence can process both in terms of requests made, searches made, maybe other aspects about thinking about whether or not this is a state-sponsored approach to biological weapons. So we want to make sure we can focus on all the good stuff while limiting the peril. Going back to your question about whether or not this is the biological weapons are the highest risk, I'd say it might be the wolf closest to the door, but chemical is still in the same neighborhood, and so I just want to be clear about that. And that's nonetheless, it is still going to be hard right now to create an AI-enabled chemical or biological threat. a chemical or biological weapons of mass destruction. That's why we want to talk about the report now and think about this whole of community effort that we can all work together to mitigate that now, as opposed to when the threat becomes more real.
So it's a great lead in to maybe step through the key findings of the report. And the first finding says build consensus among the national security, public health, animal health agencies about the range of potential risks associated with the use of AI. And having spent a lot of time in government, as you have, this has a little bit of ring of let's make sure the whole government's sort of rowing in the same direction. Was that the intent? And maybe the second part is how do we do that?
Yeah. So with regard to our fellow interagency colleagues, you're absolutely right. It's trying to make us all row together. The CWMD office here at DHS actually works really well with the interagency. We look at CBRN risks and try to detect, deter, and prevent them. We've got our response team on the other side. So we really work well with the interagency. With regard to artificial intelligence, this is new and this is novel, and trying to make sure everyone understands what the threat is and how to ameliorate it. With regard to this report and how do we all row together, we're working on an implementation plan and identifying who has the relative knowledge and the relative expertise on each of these couple dozen recommendations, and who can help identify identify the threats and what the risks are specifically. And I'll talk about intelligence in a little bit. I know near and dear to your heart. But we also want to go and figure out, and we can talk about the private sector later, but how do we take that relative subject matter expertise and convey it in a coherent way to help the private sector, the people who have created the artificial intelligence, large language models, and frontier models, how to help them have the tools to mitigate these risks related to chemical and biological threats.
So maybe, dovetailing to that, your second finding is interesting. It says clearly most models and incorporated data sets are in the hands of private or academic organizations. And so this is very different, yeah, right?
Exactly.
And so how do we as a country, I don't want to say control, because that's I don't think that's what you're talking about. But how do we ensure that the right guide rails are put in place?
Yeah. That's a great question. And this is unique. This is unusual. And artificial intelligence and the large language models are evolving at a pace and a rapid skill set that we can't comprehend right now. We can't necessarily, we certainly can't control it as the federal government or as any government. What we want to do, this is why we want to really focus on the whole of community effort to get both the private sector and our partners and allies, as well as academics, to think about how do we identify information, how do we convey that information to the large language models, how I'm thinking about it as kind of a supply chain of information, right? And understanding each element of the supply chain of information. What's the provenance of the information? Do we know a ledger of where this information came from, as we talked about the new novel recipes for chemical threats and so on? But also having people feel like they're involved in it, that there's a concept of everybody's in this together. If somebody in a biological lab sees something that's weird, have them impart the DHS motto, see something, say something, right? To go and elevate it. One of the questions we're asking right now is, where would one report that? We don't have a mechanism yet, but I have some thoughts about where that can be. But to have everybody in the ecosystem involved in the developers, the deployers, the researchers all go and say, hey, something's going on here, but also to train the AI models to look for anomalistic behavior that is a problem, to make sure that we're all working on this threat together. I think this model can be used not just for CBRN, but for other bad content. We work a lot on CSAM, on sexual exploitative material. We work on a lot of other different things that are a problem to try to go and find a way that everyone feels like they're invested in understanding this and not just saying it's not my problem. It's I'm the wholesaler. I'm just sending it down the chain, but really that they have an ownership element to this.
Mary Ellen, one of the things that has helped create the modern world is the democratization of technology, and maybe nowhere is that more profound than AI, which is now quickly in the hands of everybody or anybody who wants access to it. That poses a significant challenge, right? Because it does lower the barrier. Things that maybe bad actors couldn't do before now all of a sudden is at least within reach. How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Andy. And I agree. The access to information and the ability to understand what's going on in the world is incredibly important. And it is crucial to the development of all of us as societies. That's why we want everyone together who's working on this to go and say, how do we increase the promise of artificial intelligence while reducing that peril, while trying to find ways to either, not index information that could create bad situations like novel biological or chemical threats, to not have that available, to not return those aspects of information, because candidly, they're not needed for moving forward in today's society. There may be other high-end researchers who may need to have access to more intense biological formula or other research and process. And maybe those people are vetted at a higher level, right? More of a know your customer concept for the bespoke and the high-end research, while having those of us who are the plebeians down using these large language models to, consistent with the Olympics ad that we've seen, write a letter to our favorite sprinter. I'm not sure that use of it really needs to have the bio or the chem information easily accessible or available. So we've got to try to parse it in a way that candidly we haven't been doing with, say, for example, the internet. Right? It's kind of an entire universe, and there's all sorts of stuff in it. In this way, I think we may want to parse and separate and triage this, and that's why the report calls for that whole of government, the whole of community effort, not just government.
You raised this issue in finding 4 about the interaction that's going to be required among industry, government, academia, and certainly private citizens. Now you multiplied the difficulty of that task among all these various sort of organizations and people who may have different or competing interests. How is this doable without squelching, right?
Yep.
Right, which is the rub.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. That's the heart of the question. And candidly, this is the novel element of this report. We're looking to have a two-way communication with large language models, with developers, with deployers, with the frontier model developers. Ordinarily, as you know, the government will make a statement and issue a report like this. And then the report speaks for itself, and you go and can interpret it and you can think about it. Here, what we're trying to do is to issue the report, make people think about it, raise their visibility and awareness of this issue. I've now gone and spoken with multiple dozen companies about this issue to go and say, how can we better communicate with them? Can we understand what you're working on? What is how can we help support you on the CBRN risks or the chemical and biological risks? And it's new, it's novel. I think it's going to take a little time for us to figure out exactly what the best communication path is. And I'm happy to talk about some of the suggestions that people have if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sure. As I said, I've been talking to the private sector companies, been talking to advocacy groups. I've been talking to some academics. How do we have this feedback loop, both of the threats, the intelligent threats that we're seeing out there, and the knowledge that we have on things, and how do we up the ante in terms of red teaming by private sector companies? The first thing I'll say, Andy, is many of the frontier model developers have agreed to these voluntary commitments that are about a year old from that the president, everyone agreed to and signed at the White House. And they basically say we're going to apply a safety and security standard, and we're going to have a heightened standard for big threats like weapons of mass destruction. But they're all implementing it slightly differently, and the process is a little different. What we're looking to do is to communicate back how to think about risks, what to maybe suppress in the presentation of models, what to look at, and also how do you develop your own folks in order to develop it. As I said, it's supposed to be a two-way communication cycle, which is different, and we don't do that well in the government. But there are a couple of options. One organization that does communicate well with the private sector, and that's part of their responsibility, is NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technologies, which is, of course, part of the Department of Commerce. So they have a built-in mechanism. They are working on AI standards. We are looking to leverage them as part of the communications process. There's also the AI Safety Institute, also launched by the Department of Commerce. Since commerce has the commercial element, wants to communicate with the private sector, and has that responsibility. The AI Safety Institute is very fledgling, very early in its development, but it was created to be some of that two-way communications. So that could be an opportunity. We could also look at maybe standard setting organizations like ISO or OASIS that help define and describe settings. I think that's a little bit far afield, but I want to explore options on how do we get the information to folks that they can do a good job of applying and suppressing these risks and these threats that as the barriers to entry lower.
We're speaking with Mary Ellen Callahan, Assistant Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office. We'll have more after a quick break.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
So, Mary Ellen, a couple of the large language model companies reached out to me months ago, given one of my previous jobs was running the Weapons and Counter-Proliferation Office, and wanted to talk about CBRN. And one of the things that came up is that, first of all, I think they were unhappy with the discussions because the problem was maybe a little bigger than maybe they had imagined. But one of the issues that came up is, you can put the guide rails in place for version 2.0 of your AI, but when you're at version 4 or 5, those same guide rails now may not work because the models have gotten smarter, they're more capable, and so you've got this moving target, and it's not like a one and done. I've fixed it, and now I can move on to something else, right? Do you see it that way?
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think that's partially why we're trying to get everyone to buy into this concept and to have a feedback loop and to continue to talk about it and discuss it. There's one thing to say, these are the guardrails, we're going to suppress this information, we're going to suppress this image and so on. But as you said, AI is training themselves and getting smarter, and we need to be able to identify that process, to look at how it's evolving, and to see if and by we, I mean the private sector companies, to look at their own red teaming models, their own expertise, their own process, and look for our inputs. And that's why it has to be a dynamic, ongoing responsibility for safety and security. CBRN is one element, but there are certainly obviously other elements like CSAM that we should really be focusing on, and not just going and saying, I'm going to suppress this. Another factor, Andy, that is a little daunting is the modeling and the ingestion of video, which may be harder to detect and to combat. But we, as the federal government, want to work with the large language models and others to build in guardrails for now, but guardrails that can expand and grow and evolve as the industry does itself.
So, of course, this is not just a U.S. problem; it's an international problem, and problem. I don't mean that to be too strong, but it's an international challenge, I guess. And so, engagement with stakeholders, as you mentioned, and one of the findings is going to be your international stakeholders. It's going to be critical. What have you seen so far from partners and allies?
Yeah. We have been engaging with strategic partners and allies, and there is a real interest in specifically on the CBRN risks and working together. Again, we want to think about what the communication process is, but there is a real appetite to have more of this engagement and two-way communication among our let's just say our close allies. And we want to continue to push those conversations as well. I know the UN is working on some other angles as well, but I would leave that to our Department of State colleagues to focus on that. But I think it can't be just a U.S. solution, because otherwise you'll see forum shopping by the model developers, and also people trying to find the lowest common denominator rather than a good median approach to compliance.
We talk about, what is the dangers of AI, but AI can be used both for offensive defense. And so the idea of using AI to help us detect threats, prevent them. But let me just sort of give you my view here. And that's sometimes the defense part of this seems to fall into a crack. Right? Whose responsibility exactly is it? And I know there are companies out there in the U.S. who have early detection capabilities, and I think what they struggle with sometimes is that everyone sort of says, "Oh, well, that's CDC," or "No, that's NIH," or "That's DHS," or "That's the intelligence community," and it's sort of hard to see who's the owner here, right? They can drive this forward. Am I missing the mark there?
Yeah, I mean, I think in our report we say that there is, a panoply of different laws and responsibilities and obligations on the federal government. Some may say that's a weakness. I actually think that might be a strength, because you can look at these issues sometimes as export control, sometimes as antitrust, as we saw in the decision yesterday, sometimes as intellectual property, and there could be different ways we could attack it civilly, criminally, with restrictions. With regard to who does what and the CBRN risk, that's partially why my team, my strong policy team, is working on an implementation plan and actually defining kind of who has overlapping jurisdiction, who does what. It's the first step, and then the next step is to go and say, okay, now what can we do about that? Are there things that each of us can do from a regulatory perspective? Not where we want to lead, because regulatory options are reactive, but there might be some targeted ways we could leverage existing authorities. But it is what has been very helpful in our interagency discussions that we've been having about this report is that we're starting to see that people have different perspectives, rather than just saying, I have the authority, I'm going to stay in this lane, I'm just going to implement this lane. We're really having the interagency talk to each other about which one is the relatively stronger position, which one's the relatively stronger knowledge, how do we communicate our intelligence findings, effectively to folks? Can we do a tear line on these things, and other elements of that? It is broadening all of our apertures so we can see what's in our neighborhood and that we can see how we can work together more collaboratively.
That's great. Sometimes, both you and I have an experience. You're given additional responsibilities without any additional money. And of course, it's hard to do these things without, a funding source, sort of taken out of high. Sometimes it's the approach, which is very difficult to often do. And then things can just sort of die because of that. Is that something that you're thinking about too?
Absolutely. And I think each of the interagencies is looking at that. I know that there has been a push from OMB to identify what AI resources you're going to need and how to bolster that. Obviously, I use artificial intelligence here at CWMD for my own needs, for biosurveillance needs, for making my radiological and nuclear detection more efficient. So we want to bolster that. There's been a big push associated with that. I think your point about other duties as assigned is a fair one. And that's why, but with that said, we're at this watershed moment, Andy, where we've got to think about how do we build this better communications model and how do we have it be a two-way street rather than just one way. Here's my report, interpret it as you may. This is the moment that we can capitalize on that. And so that's why I'm prioritizing this, both on my policy side and my technological side. Obviously, DHS is really very active in AI. We have a great chief AI officer in Eric Heisen, and we have some AI core teams, some folks who are joining the team in an expedited hiring process, which has been great. And we're looking to leverage that aspect as well. But of course, DHS has many work streams for artificial intelligence. I think that the conversations I've had on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, have indicated that folks recognize that this is a crucial moment, a pivotal one, so to speak.
So what's required here, it seems to me, is a sort of a global monitoring capability, right? Because there's going to, you have to have attribution. You have to understand, where things are coming from. Just because, if you're just thinking about biology, just because you see a new virus doesn't mean it was created. It could have evolved or not, depending, right? So being able to sort all that out seems critical in this, and AI would be a great tool in doing that. But do you see that as a first step, this sort of building out this capability to sort of sense the environment so that we understand what's out there? I mean, how do you do it if you don't have a baseline, I guess is what I'm thinking about.
So I think that's part of it. I would say we talked about how this was private sector generated and private sector evolved. I don't think that putting an overlay of a government monitoring is necessarily the way to do it. We wanted to make sure that we had the ability to be flexible. I think I would argue that we might want to give the private sector companies more of the tools rather than relying on a government or governments.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, we have to. Number one, we won't be able to scale. It'll be Sisyphean. And then we would be the point of failure rather than having everybody feel like they're working on this together. So I don't have an exact model yet, Andy, but I think that we are developing this, supply chain of information concept and that everyone has a part to play in it. You can, have your ledger about where things come from and the provenance. And then also, what does that mean in the impact? So I don't think the first step is to try to detect or defend everything, because if we do that, as we talked about, AI is expanding and developing and growing in ways we can't imagine and calculate, and we'll be chasing our tail if that's what our first step of defense is. I think it's part of the calculation and maybe part of the formula that there is some sort of detection, but that detection is a combination of private sector, academia, government entities and interests, as we all kind of have this defense in depth.
So what's the, your sort of a realistic estimate of time? How long before you start to feel that we've begun to, because it sounds like at the moment we're just starting to grapple with the problem. I mean, AI burst on the scene. It's only been a few years now, right?
Yep.
How long do you think before you begin to feel like, okay, we've begun to master the challenge? I'm just worried about the threats outpacing. We're solving, yesterday's problem, and the threat has moved in front of us.
I wholeheartedly agree that we shouldn't be looking to solve yesterday's problem, and that's why I don't think we need to monitor the whole thing, because if we try to do that, we won't be able to. I actually think we've made some pretty great headway. Those voluntary commitments from last year are the cornerstone on which we'll build this. It is the statements by the frontier models developers on what they're going to work on. There are very significant private sector interest on kind of how do we get our arms around this. I called this a watershed moment earlier, and I think that's exactly what it is. So I think we've made some good progress already, considering the executive order is not yet a year old, and that we've got all this interest. I think we can start to build a framework relatively quickly, and hopefully with enough oomph, and then work on getting that whole of community investment into the concept. I'm cautiously optimistic that we can really make a dent relatively soon, because this is the time to do it.
Yeah, I agree. Unfortunately, sometimes we respond best in a crisis, and this is the best time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining.
Yeah, I will say, people have been, as I said, our conversations with the private sector, they have been very engaged on this and want to be engaged on this, and I've been very encouraged by that engagement, because they have to be part of this in order to make this succeed.
It was also encouraging to hear you say that the international community is sort of, I guess they're, in some ways, they're waiting for us to drive, right?
Well, the EU has an AI Act that has just gone into place, which kind of talks about the higher risk threats. So there is a tiered element in their implementation. It in my opinion, their implementation mirrors their GDPR approach. And so I'm not sure how nimble it can be, but I don't know that legislation, whether it's from the EU or the US, is the answer, but instead to try to have everybody work together to help identify it.
Right. Mary Ellen, thanks. This has been a great discussion. Where can people get the report? It's very digestible. It's not super long. So where can
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So we have a whole artificial intelligence area on DHS.gov, and our report is linked there. It's also, you can go to DHS.gov. So the DHS artificial intelligence is in the publication sections as well, the publication library. Or also look up Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction. My office has it posted there as well.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. Thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thanks, Andy.
That was Mary Ellen Callahan, Assistant Secretary for DHS's Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office. I'm Andy McCretis. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry and Sophia Rubin. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.